Hello everyone, today's lab is going to be on the Grignard reaction. So what is the Grignard reaction? It's a reaction that creates a carbon-carbon bond during synthesis, and this is actually very important because carbon-carbon bonds are formation of carbon-carbon bonds are very coveted during synthesis because you could use them to build up larger molecules. And the way these carbon-carbon bonds are formed is through the formation of a Grignard reagent. And the way we form this reagent is I have an example here, we take an alkyl halide. Just a quick side note, it doesn't have to be an alkyl halide. We'll see later, it could be an aryl halide as well. But for this example, we'll take an alkyl halide and we'll react it with magnesium metal. And we'll do this in dry ether, which means this ether has no water in it, it's anhydrous. And you can see a picture here on the left of the process taking place. You'll see these magnesium shavings with this solution that contains an alkyl halide in there. So what happens when we mix the two together is the magnesium will actually complex with the halogen on the alkyl halide, and the magnesium atom will insert itself between the halogen and the carbon and form a carbon magnesium bond. So it's a carbon metal bond. And the special thing about this type of bond is that it's a highly polarized bond. So that means that the electrons in that bond, they're going to be around the carbon atom most of the time, as opposed to the magnesium atom. And this occurs because carbon is a lot more electronegative than magnesium. So what's going to happen is this carbon is going to have a partial negative charge, while the MgX is going to have a partial positive charge. And because of this, we could draw this compound, even though it's a covalent bond, we can draw it as a purely ionic species with an ionic bond. And you see here, when we do that, we have a carbon with a lone pair with a formal negative charge on it. And this is a carbanion. And we see that this lone pair has a potential to act as a nucleophile. And as a matter of fact, this is exactly what we see in practice. And like I said before, this reaction is very powerful because it's able to form carbon-carbon bonds. And the chemist who developed this reaction, Victor Grignard, actually won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for this. And this reaction is still used today in many organic chemistry labs. Now let's just go over the mechanism of the Grignard reaction and what we could use it to synthesize. So on the top, I have a general reaction scheme. We could actually use the Grignard reagent and react it with carbonyls, right? So if this carbonyl with the two R groups, let's pretend it's like an aldehyde or ketone. We have to remember that the carbonyl carbon is partially positive. And this is because the oxygen it's bonded to is more electronegative than the carbon. So it's going to be pulling electron density away from it, causing it to be partially positive. Now, because of that, it's actually a good electrophile. So it's susceptible to nucleophilic attack. And when we introduce a Grignard reagent to the substrate, this is exactly what happens. The lone pair is going to attack the carbonyl carbon. The electrons are going to kick up onto the oxygen. We're going to form this alkoxide intermediate, which then can be protonated with an acid to form our final alcohol product. Now, down below, I have a specific example. We have methyl chloride and magnesium. They react in dry ether to form our Grignard reagent. The carbanion will then attack the carbonyl carbon of formaldehyde. Again, the electrons will kick up onto the oxygen. We'll have this intermediate right here, which is again an alkoxide, which is protonated, and we get our final product, which is actually a primary alcohol. And if this alcohol looks familiar, it's because it is ethanol, which is just drinking alcohol. So take note of that. With a Grignard reaction, you can make drinking alcohol. Now, you can make more than just primary alcohols. You could also make secondary and tertiary alcohols just by switching the substrate. So if instead of using formaldehyde here on the top, we use some other aldehyde with an alkyl substituent on it, like this one, for example, acetaldehyde, we could take our Grignard reagent. Again, the mechanism is exactly the same. The lone pair will attack the electrophilic carbon, which is the carbonyl carbon. The electrons will be kicked up onto the oxygen, as shown. We will get an alkoxide intermediate, which will be protonated by an acid, and we will get our resulting secondary alcohol. Now, if we want a tertiary alcohol, we could just use a ketone. And the example I used here is acetone. This is the substrate that I drew in. We're using the same exact Grignard reagent, same exact process. The lone pair will attack the carbonyl carbon, which is electrophilic, kick the electrons up onto the oxygen, form this alkoxide intermediate, which is then protonated by an acid, and we get our tertiary alcohol. So just by changing the substrate, we could change what type of alcohols that we get. Now, we could also use this reaction to create carboxylic acids. And this is actually what's done in your lab manual. This is what's done in the experiment. So what they do is they get an area halide, shown here, which is bromobenzene. They react it with magnesium in dry ether, has to be dry, no water can be present, and we form our Grignard reagent. The Grignard reagent will then attack a molecule of CO2 at the carbon. The electrons in the pi orbital between the carbon and the oxygen will be kicked up onto the oxygen, forming this carboxylate intermediate, which can then be protonated by an acid, and we get our final product, which is benzoic acid. Now, side reactions. So remember, I stressed that the ether needs to be dry. All the conditions when you're working with Grignard reagents needs to exclude water or any other protic solvent that could easily act as an acid. And this is why. So let's say in our first step, we make our Grignard reagent flawlessly, but then somehow along the way, some water is introduced into the reaction. So what's going to happen is we're going to take our Grignard reagent. We have to remember that nucleophilicity and basicity, so how good a nucleophile is and how strong a base is, they're correlated. So the better nucleophile a compound in is, usually the better base it is as well. Now there's factors that you also have to take into account to this, so like steric hindrance, stuff like that, but there's a good general rule. So since our Grignard reagents are good nucleophiles, they're also going to be good bases. And if your Grignard reagent encounters water, it's just going to pluck off one of these hydrogens, like an acid-base reaction. And what it's going to form is the corresponding hydrocarbon and hydroxide anion. And this kills the Grignard reagent. So this is usually not what we want. So if you're going to react it with some type of substrate, then it's not going to happen because it was just protonated and it's no longer reactive. Now, technically, this could be a method of synthesizing hydrocarbons. You wouldn't really want to do this because you could usually just buy the hydrocarbons pretty cheap. But let's say you really needed the hydrocarbon and all you had was alkyl halides. In theory, you could definitely do a Grignard reaction and just react it with water or some other protic solvent, and you will get a hydrocarbon product. But in practice, that would be inefficient as far as expenses go. And that's pretty much the entire lecture. All I really wanted to show you today is what a Grignard reaction was, the steps that are done in order to form the Grignard reagent. I want to show you why you could write the Grignard reagent as a purely ionic compound. I want to show you how it acts as a nucleophile, and I want to show you some synthetic applications of the Grignard reaction. I also want to show you the mechanism. So take note of the mechanism. We will have a quiz next class on the 29th. Yes. So on the 29th, we're going to have a quiz on the Grignard reaction. And you haven't covered it in a lecture, so please take note of this mechanism and just the overall synthesis. And that's pretty much it. I'll also send you the video for this lab, and the person who did it also did a pretty good job explaining the Grignard reaction, so you'll also have that to go by. All right, good luck.